All right. Assalamu alaikum. I love talking about some of the stories that, starting these things, to give people an idea about the human side of being Muslim. Because I'm always shocked to find out that there are so many people really who have never met Muslims. And I think that, it's very easy to have a conception of a scary persona, something that, you just don't really know what to think if you've never met a Muslim. And I think that it's really incumbent on everyone in every situation that you can, or every opportunity that you might have, to share your personal story and humanize what it means to be Muslim. Hopefully people will see that it's just a very, human experience. But we have to break that barrier, and we have to start telling our stories. And so I like taking this opportunity to talk about my story. For me, my passion is always about converts and conversion, but also about sort of the transformation in kind of choosing this journey to become Muslim. And hopefully that, can help people, understand what it means to be Muslim. So, I always say that what is the point of being, part of any faith or any religion, and definitely what is the point of being Muslim if it doesn't have a transformative effect in your life and make you a better human being. And so one of the most difficult transformations that I had to make after I became a Muslim was realizing that I was a racist and that I was raised as a racist. And this is a really difficult thing to admit to yourself. No one wants to say that they are a racist. No one wants to admit it, because it's like saying I'm a very ugly person inside. And I think it's really hard to do that. But especially here in America, and especially in California. But I think that, but I was raised a racist, and it comes from the messages that you get from your upbringing. So I don't know how, but somehow, my family is Taiwanese. They were immigrants, as I mentioned before, and I think by the time that I was aware that I was even Chinese, somehow, maybe through my mother's breast milk, I also became aware of what the Asian hierarchy of racism is. And I didn't know any people from any of these other Asian cultures, but through whatever I experienced, I understood that Taiwanese were at the top of that hierarchy, and then below that were probably mainland Chinese and Japanese. And then somewhere below that would come maybe people from Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, and at the very bottom of that hierarchy were people from, let's say, Vietnam and the Philippines, and Cantonese people. So I could definitely recite that without any evidence. And then if you look at sort of what your parental expectations are for who you marry, I think that is also very revealing. So by the same token, I told you before, I was raised to sort of look up to white culture, and so for me it was very clear from my, I needed, the best thing would be if I married a white person. And then if I can't marry a white person, then, I should marry maybe someone who's Chinese, and that down the road, after actually Chinese or Japanese, it kind of becomes a skin color. So it's like, you don't want to marry someone who's brown, and God forbid, someone who's black. And for me, of course, I'm an only child, so this was actually, also a very big influence for my psyche. And then if you layer on top of that skin color something like Muslim, oh my God, that's like the worst you could do. So thankfully, I made a very good choice in who I married. And, but of course, as you can imagine, that sent all kinds of shockwaves through my family, and it's part of my whole story of the struggle of conversion. But this is a, I don't say this actually to blame my parents, because, obviously, racism is something that we all know is brewing and explosive, and it's kind of the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, but it's really, reaching seismic levels. And I think it's something that is really important that we have to understand. And, it has to start with sort of an understanding of who you are and being very honest about, what your views are and what you inherited from your upbringing. So, as Dr. Abou El Fadl talked about in actually the khutbah from last Friday, as well as some previous halakas, racism was the reason why Shaitan was, thrown out by God. So it's really interesting because you think, this is sort of the Muslim original sin, if you think in terms of what was the original sin. And racism, obviously is with us as human beings from the very beginning. So, what did that look like for me? I mean, it was, I think, aside from the obvious, if you see someone who's African American, I think, people would say, okay, maybe you clutch your purse a little bit harder or you get a little bit fearful. But I think that the racism comes in the nuance. And part of understanding, how deeply you're affected is seeing, like, what are your reactions? So, it had gotten even to a point where it's like, okay, if I speak to someone who is African American or, Mexican or whatever, I would almost pat myself on the back and say, see, I'm not racist. I talk to people who are, not of the white race. But if you think about that, that's disgusting. If you start thinking about, okay, my patience level for interacting with white people is endless. I can be extremely patient and kind and whatever, but how is my patience level when I'm dealing with someone who's not white? And these are the sorts of things that, are really, really difficult to interrogate. But I bring this up because, if you are a Muslim and you want to have any hope of ethical or spiritual uplift, you simply cannot be a racist. And you have to do the hard work of understanding, what your orientation is and deal with it. So, what did that mean as far as, attacking it? Like, how do you break this? And, simply, there's nothing really magical to it. It's actually really just first knowing who you are, knowing the truth of who you are, where you came from. All the little comments that you might hear from whoever. It's like, oh, those Jews, oh, those, those Mexicans, oh, those whatever. And, being sensitized to hearing those kinds of comments. And also putting yourself in that person's shoes. I mean, it's truly the golden rule. It's like, how do you want to be treated? That's how you should treat others. And it's sort of funny for a Chinese person to say, I'm a racist, because it's like, I have definitely been the recipient of racism. I mean, you know how it tastes, you know how it smells, you know when someone's treating you based on how you appear, not because of who you are. So I actually really have no excuse. Like, I would get into fights with my parents because they would be racist about Muslims or something, and I'd be like, how can you do that? You're Chinese, you know how it feels. How can you turn around and then be that way to someone else? But you can. It's very easy. It can, be very much part of what you slip into. So I was fortunate that, the racism that was directed at me was not, to the level of danger. So, for example, that, Muslims are getting exposed to today, or that African Americans deal with on a daily basis. But, at the same time, it doesn't feel good. And there's a really interesting book out that just came out called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And it's really interesting because it's written about how white people cannot talk about racism. Like, they become very fragile because they don't like to see themselves as, well, obviously as being racist, and there are certain reasons why that is, and it's a book about how do you talk to white people about racism without making them sort of cringe and, and deny everything that you're saying, and how do you get them to see that, racism is something that's real, and that they're not just objective and individual, and that they're not, they're immune from it. And that's a really interesting, book to look into. I was actually looking at it online. It was fascinating. But those are for people who actually, I think, have not really had the experience of being discriminated against. And, for all of us, I think, as Muslim, we have had that experience. And, we know what it likes and know what it feels like to be considered something other than what we are. And I think that if we want to play, let's say, a leading role in making change in our world, knowing that, the notion of racism as our original sin is something that is, part of our tradition that we need to fight, then we need to start by cleaning our own house. And I know that when I see, cultural centers or mosques that are Pakistani and Arab and, whatever organized by ethnicity or by race, that tells me that we are not in a place where we can, be on the leading front of racism. And I think that, if we can start by interrogating ourselves as individuals and interrogating our communities, then we can start to really make a change and offer something to humanity, because we know that racism is going to be a serious problem in the coming days, and it already is. And the thing that's really beautiful, I sort of think to myself that I'm a recovering racist, because it's hard. It's like racism was one of those things that it's as familiar to you as your parents. It's been as long, it's been with you as long as you've been alive. So it is really difficult to, work hard and see it in yourself and try to change it. But the thing is, when you actually start to do that, you start to walk in people's shoes, you start to talk to people, you recognize that they're having a very human experience like you start being able to look beyond a person's skin color, their appearance, and I noticed that you start to see people through their eyes. You hear this expression that your eyes are the window to your soul. And I think one of the most beautiful things that, and I pray all the time that, Allah helps me overcome all of these weaknesses, and I say this, it's obviously not very comfortable to say, hey, I'm a racist, or I was a racist, but I do it because I think it's so important that we all approach our lives with that kind of honesty. And when you can start to see people from the light of their soul, through their eyes, through their behavior, through how they treat other people, it changes your life, and it makes your life richer and more beautiful. And so I think that it's exciting, and I just want to tell people you can overcome racism, but it takes a lot of hard work. And anyway, so that's my story for today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mentioned it, but yeah, you can talk about it.
Okay, before we continue the Tafsir Surah al Rahman, inshallah, my hope is that we complete it today. Grace announced that, inshallah, we will have an event where Maryam Ramadan, Tariq Ramadan's daughter, has an opportunity to talk about the case involving her father. This is and some of you might know that I wrote an article about this. We'll see if Al Jazeera publishes one version of the article. But I want to take a minute and just talk about why I think this is an important issue. I'm not sure what Muslims are about if they are not guided by the ethical teachings of Sharia. If you accept the idea of Islam as a human being on this earth in a covenantal relationship, in a relationship of covenant with Allah, where you actually defer to the ethical parameters that Allah sets and the laws that Allah sets, if that's not a cornerstone of your being, then the entire idea of Islam as a moral enterprise, as a moral message, becomes undone, and it becomes just simply a matter of identity, which is extremely problematic. Now, the reason I say this is that I am quite troubled by the way that I've seen Muslims handle accusations and fall prey to the gossip mills of social media. The Quran tells us very clearly, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. The instruction is that we have a duty to inquire, and here I'll pause 1 second. The verse says, إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ. Now, fasiq here, if you hear slanderous news or you receive negative news about someone, fasiq here, most commentators said means someone that مجهول الهوية, that is could be a credible source or could be a source lacking credibility. Because in the ethical message of Islam, accusing someone of a moral crime is a moral crime in itself. So repeating an accusation in itself is a moral crime, and the moral crime of slander is a very serious one in Islam. Now, here when Tariq Ramadan is involved, أصل الأشياء البراءة وبراءة الذمة, that the presumption is always the innocence, and the burden of proof, البينة على من ادعى, is always, the burden of proof is upon the person who makes an accusation. When you have someone of the status of Tariq Ramadan, and by the way, I mean, let me be very clear, I'm not friends with Tariq Ramadan, so I'm not defending a friend, and my point is not to defend. My point is procedural. It's a matter of process, the ethics of the process. Someone who is a prominent scholar, who has written a great deal and done a great deal with the intention of serving Islam, and someone who has served Muslims, and especially Muslims in Europe and Muslims in the West quite widely. Now, the accusation of rape is a very serious accusation. But there is a place and a structure to prove that accusation. And the place and the structure is qada, in a judiciary, where testimony is heard, where there's an assessment of the credibility of witnesses, where evidence is scrutinized, and then a judgment made about innocence or guilt, which is all judgments in matters like this is evidentially based, meaning we do our best. But that process, in order to take place, must take place within the confines of within the sacredness of a judicial process. In other words, the accused stands and the accuser presents themselves, and the accuser presents the evidence that they have or whatever testimony they have. The accused gets an opportunity to defend themselves without the intervention of a mob mentality and mob gossip. And that's the problem that I have with the Tariq Ramadan case. That's one problem, is that every Muslim have jumped on the social media, either assessing guilt or innocence, without a tabayyun, without the duty to scrutinize anything. Now, So this is a matter of principle. When someone stands accused of a serious crime, and that's why I was silent about this for a very long time, and I didn't want to discuss it. Because when someone stands accused of a serious crime, you must exercise restraint and refrain from discussing the case and speculating upon guilt or innocence or whatnot until the matter is adjudicated within the hollow confines of a judiciary. The intervention of a mob, either on the side of the defendant or the side of the accuser, is always negative, and it is always corruptive of a judicial process. So that's one thing. The other thing, now when the accusers here have been all over the European media, Hinda Ayari especially has given tons of interviews. Now, most Muslims don't understand French and have not had the opportunity to perhaps listen to her interviews, but I have. And I have been troubled very much by the narratives she gives, because they, from the numerous interviews she's done and her book, there are inconsistencies that are systematic and persistent. If you had experience with dealing with people, I work in the human trafficking field and I've dealt with a lot of human trafficking victims, and if you've had the opportunity to work with trauma victims, all I can say is I am troubled by what I hear from this witness particularly, and that's the witness that has been most visible and most pronounced. There's another accuser who has posted numerous anti-Islamic jargon on the woman named Christelle, or given the name Christelle, a lot of very Islamophobic postings that she posted before the alleged date of the rape. And there are a lot of issues about her testimony as well. Now, so we have been thrust in a situation where the court or the French legal system has allowed the accusers a free rein in the media, allowed them to speak to the media in every context, to present their accusations in very public forums, while the same court locked up Tariq Ramadan, not just not allowed him to speak to the media, but not allowed him even access to his own court files, which are severely regulated to him and to his attorney, which is very odd. There are numerous very prominent French lawyers who've studied the case and signed onto statements protesting the very odd way that Tariq Ramadan is being dealt with, that amounts to a denial of due process. I wish the French legal system treated Tariq Ramadan fairly, so that at least he would have an opportunity to defend himself rigorously, and then in that case we can feel that the matter has been fairly dealt with, and we can say just leave it to the French legal system to adjudicate guilt or innocence without us getting involved one way or the other. But what troubles me is that that's not what happened. Tariq Ramadan has been dealt with through the same procedural categories that terrorist suspects are dealt with. Not just solitary confinement, but various restrictions on how often he can see his lawyers, how often he can meet his family, whether he can look at his record, whether he can obtain reading and writing material in jail cell. And if you can imagine, if you are detained for a crime, and denied access to the library, denied access to a computer, denied access to writing and reading material, your access to your lawyers and to your family is severely restricted, denied access, you and your attorney denied access to even the court record itself or your judicial records, your ability to defend yourself against accusations are severely restricted. It doesn't take a genius to see that, to understand that, and to understand why is it that there are so many prominent jurists, French and otherwise, that are objecting to the way this case is being handled. Now, and that corrupts the process, because then when a case is handled this way, then we lose confidence in the ultimate adjudication of innocence or guilt. Unless a case is handled with a fair hand, then you are in doubt at the way, in the ultimate conclusion reached by a judiciary, because if a case becomes politicized, it corrupts the nature of the education. I mean, among the fields that I teach is the politicization of cases. It's a seminar called Political Crimes. When does a state politicize a criminal case and when it does not politicize a criminal case? And I can tell you that historically in legal system, when states politicize criminal cases, it becomes extremely corrupting to the judicial process. Now, why further, other than the fact that Tariq Ramadan's family is suffering a great deal of isolation and so on, other than the fact that I am troubled by the unfairness in the way that this case has been dealt with, both by the judiciary, but also by the media and the public. There are things that deeply concern me about this case, and that is the role of Islamophobes in embracing the accusers. And the connections and the financial and other than financial support that the accusers has received, and here I'm talking about the accusers from France, and Maryam Ramadan can talk about the accuser in Switzerland. But the involvement of Islamophobes, and the way that I can draw a parallel to you, is that when I see a rape charge, I immediately want to give the potential victim, the accuser, every opportunity to prove her or his case, because this is a very serious charge. My natural sympathies, I have to admit, are with the accuser. When I find the rape charge, my natural sympathies is to believe the woman charging rape or otherwise. Because I tend to think, well, why would they lie? But then I must restrain myself and respect the presumption of innocence and give it its full due. When Islamophobia gets involved, it's very much like when I find a rape accusation against a black man and I discover that the woman accusing the black man has extensive ties with the KKK or white supremacist groups. It troubles me because then I am not sure if my sympathies with the accusers is well placed. When I find, this by the way happened in the colonial era all the time, where white women would accuse a native, an Indian, or a Bangladeshi, or a Sri Lankan of rape, and you find the colonial state has taken, it deals with the case as if that native has offended the honor of the colonial state, and these cases, ignoring the colonial setting, ignoring the imbalance in power dynamics, is idiotic and indefensible. Likewise in the US, when you find an accusation by a woman tied into the network of white supremacy against a black man, or we had also similar accusations like that in the U.S. by white women against Native Americans, Indians. Here, the ties between the accusers and the Islamophobic, the entrenched Islamophobic network in France and the traditional political foes of Tariq Ramadan troubles me deeply. And it makes me say the court had an obligation to go out of its way to make sure that the judicial process is fair-handed. If I am a judge, I would say because of the political connotations and the political implications, and because there are political opponents involved, I will close down the courtroom, I will seal the record, I will put a gag order, and I will adjudicate this case on solely and uniquely an evidentiary basis. I will shut the politics out of the courtroom. But that's not what happened. The court continues to allow the French media to report on every hearing with open access, continues to allow the accused to appear at every media outlet and speak openly without any restrictions, and continues to lock up Tariq Ramadan. And what I also discovered is that in countries like England, you cannot talk at all about the accusers according to them, it's illegal. I actually tried to find what is the basis of that claim that it's illegal. I couldn't find it. I mean, several media outlets said, oh, well, we can't publish anything about the Hindayari or what she alleges or what she doesn't, unlike the French media, because that's against the law in England. I tried to find precedent for that, or to find the actual law that this is based on. I couldn't find it. Anyway, we cannot ignore, and this is why now that I've watched more than 30 different interviews, including Hindayari, by the way, was interviewed in Egypt, in Al-Ashira Masa. And, you know, so she's even reached it. And Robert Spencer is organizing a tour for her in the U.S. So after watching and numerous interventions by the accusers and supporters, it is only fair to try to balance out the power dynamics a bit by allowing someone to speak on behalf of Tariq Ramadan. And in this case, I can't, of course, you can't get the lawyer to speak, partly because if the lawyer speaks in an interview, it's expensive for the family, and they're out of money. And so the next best thing is, well, the best thing would have been Tariq Ramadan himself, but we can't do that because he's locked up and not allowed to speak to the media. So Maryam Ramadan is the next best thing. And I hope that people will ask her whatever questions they have. I personally would have preferred that there are no interviews, that we don't speak to Maryam Ramadan and we don't speak to Hindayari, and that the entire matter would be done within a closed courtroom. But that's not the situation we're in. And Tariq Ramadan has been, in the French media and in European media, is already talked about as if he's been tried and convicted. And sadly, with a lot of Muslims, they also talk about it as if it's a foregone thing. There is a huge difference between consensual affairs. Whether he had affairs or not is not something I'm willing to even address. That's ghaiba, and that's another level of slander. And unless I present 4 witnesses, you know what my punishment would be. The issue is not consensual sex. The issue is rape. And that's different. And so I'm extremely troubled because I have seen more ethical introspection from Christian and Jewish groups than I've seen from Muslim groups. Muslims repeat the same powerless dynamic that they engaged in since colonialism, and that is silence. Muslims don't stand up for rights, they simply become silent and bicker amongst themselves. We have been like that since the age of colonialism. These are psychological attitudes that have been instilled in our milk through the colonial period, that we don't stand up to anyone except we bickering amongst ourselves. And that is extremely troubling when you find that the Islam that is in the West replicates the same illnesses of a disempowered people that you witness from the colonial legacy. I could go on, because as you can see, I mean, this ties into so many cases like this. Test our mettle and test who we are as a people, and they test whether we are able to think through God's Sharia and to reason through what God's Sharia requires from us in order to sustain the mizan. أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ in Surah al Rahman. That you must deal with the mizan in a just and equitable balance. And the minute it becomes an imbalanced treatment, if Muslims themselves can't recognize the imbalance, and that's problematic. That's extremely problematic. Okay. Does anyone want to say anything about this before I move on to Surah al Rahman?
Where is the interview going to? And when?
We are arranging it for, it'll be mid to late August. But what we wanted to do is invite community leaders who to come, like, have so Dr. Fadl will have a conversation with Miriam via Skype. She'll be, in Paris. And we would invite, like, the leaders of the community to come and ask them questions, because we're hoping that this can sort of, engender some action on this part. But we'll still live stream it so people can watch it. So because we're in limited space, we want to have this space for people who, hopefully can
do it in a
something.
larger space or somewhere else?
We can talk about all of that, because
Okay.
we just pretty much, we're going to work through the details.
Okay.
And, but I'll share more information as we have it.
Okay.
Do you think it's a good idea to put articles and stuff like that on Facebook about it? I had put some, when they said that the lady was lying, and I had very good reactions actually from French people. But are they effective or not, I have no idea. But maybe if we put more social media, no? I don't know.
I mean, there's a lot of information that's out there, and and I don't know if you saw the article that Dr. Abou El Fadl wrote about this whole issue. So, I mean, I think it's fine to share. I think the issue is more about the process.
The legal
About the legal process.
Because I mean, part of this is that as a result of this, everything that Tariq Ramadan has written is now being, by the people who are who believe that he's already guilty.
Yeah.
Everything he's written has been sidetracked, and this will be a tragedy because he had quite an important intellectual product. And I mean, I would argue that it's whether he's guilty or not, it shouldn't affect our ability to read and assess the intellectual product. But that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is I already know a lot of professors that used to assign readings by Tariq Ramadan that have withdrawn them from their classes because they don't want to assign readings by someone accused of rape. Now, of course, that makes the Islamophobes who have been traditional enemies of Tariq Ramadan extremely happy. I mean, so if he is guilty, he could not have given them a greater gift than this. And if he's not guilty, the way we are handling this case as Muslims could not be a greater gift to them than this. But as Muslims, our duty is to pressure the French government to deliver a fair trial, to exert political pressure so that he is dealt with fairly. And you cannot, I don't know if those of you who are not lawyers and never been accused of something, you have no, it's very difficult to imagine how defending yourself in a criminal trial is an absolute uphill battle. And so it's because it's extremely costly, and it engulfs your entire life. And if you are detained with access restricted to transcripts of testimony, to precisely what the entire evidence against a defendant is, etc., your ability to defend yourself becomes severely handicapped. And so, I wish he would have been dealt with as the French legal system, by the way, has a sustained practice that you can verify yourself by looking at the dockets of numerous cases. The people normally that are not released before the trial are either repeat felons or quite often unlawful, undocumented aliens who have committed crimes. So there is a very ingrained racist practice, by the way, in pre-trial detentions in France. So the vast majority of those who are held in pre-trial detentions tend to be colored people, Africans and North Moroccans, and now at the same time, whites are regular, even with crimes, even serial rapists have been given a supervised release. People accused of raping as much as 8 women or 20 women and so on. Even if he was not released, at least give him complete access to the means and the instruments to defend himself. So there are a lot of troubling things, and I'll let Maryam Ramadan talk about them because she, of course, knows the details of the particulars of the case. But the fact that this is increasingly looking to me, and Allahu Alam, and may Allah forgive me if I'm wrong, like a political assassination by the French state, rather than a criminal adjudication, troubles me to the core. Because there were not 2 Tariq Ramadans in Europe. Not because of personality issues, but because of the role he played in the public arena as an intellectual. We don't have any other Muslim figure who debated French philosophers on equal footing on issues like secularism and the relationship between religion and secularism, etc. Every other, we simply don't have that intellectual caliber in Europe. I've actually searched. We don't. So it is a huge loss. And Muslims should not simply, if you haven't read the man's work, before you are so gayfully jumping on the bandwagon of gossip, understand what the loss is going to be. This is not a small hit. This is a huge strike because the man is going to go down with his intellectual product. And that intellectual product is valuable, whether you like the man or not, regardless. So I speak my conscience. I kept my silence for a very long time because I was studying everything I could study. And I did not want to speak about it until I finished studying everything I could put I've contacted numerous students by Tariq Ramadan. I've sent Tariq Ramadan students and I've talked to them about whether they've experienced things, etc. The accusations are from people in France and this woman in Switzerland, which has a whole story to herself, but I've also inquired about the legacy in Oxford in itself. And I speak only after I've reached the point where I feel that not speaking could be a sin. and I don't want to meet Allah with that. I don't want to meet Allah and, tell me you've witnessed this and you said nothing. And of course, that it would be much better if I didn't say anything for me personally, because this is an issue that there's no up to it. There's no game to saying anything in defense of someone in like Tariq Ramadan's situation. There's absolutely nothing to gain from it. There's everything to lose.
How is it different that a rape case different than an actual, say, zina and the 4 witnesses? How do you separate the two and how do you treat each?
It's very different procedurally and evidentially as well. Zina, you need 4 witnesses. A rape case was treated eventually by the vast majority of jurists under the category of hiraba. And in hiraba, you get circumstantial evidence is accepted, eyewitness testimony is accepted under 4, and physical evidence is accepted. So, and hiraba is a very different type of judicial process than zina.
Can you translate zina and hiraba?
Zina is fornication or adultery, consensual. Hiraba is the crime of terrorizing people. Now, in early period of the development of Islamic law, hiraba, which is mentioned in the Quran, as it was limited to highway robbery and piracy. Then, eventually, it becomes extended in Islamic law to include not just highway robbers and pirates, but also rapists. Especially, so if you attack someone and sexually assault them in their home or in the road, in either case, it would be considered a crime of haraba. And so eventually, it became treated as an evidentiary and procedural matter entirely differently than zina. In the modern age, and sometimes in Islamic history, also political criminals became treated as muharibun. But let's leave that aside. I mean, I've written an entire book about this. It's called The Law of Rebellion in Islam. I talk about the law of hiraba in it for a lot. But because that's a big topic, but that's a nutshell of it. Hiraba is rape and is the crime of assault through or inducing subjugation of the victim through terror. It's terrorizing a victim, whether then you take their property or you hurt them or you rape them. And the evidentiary requirements become much looser. So you don't need 4 witnesses. You can prove your case simply through circumstantial evidence and through physical evidence. So
I have a question regarding what should American Muslim do when in the United States we are basically shadowed with the Me Too movement after the Harvey Weinstein scandal, and specifically for American Muslims, we sort of have the lighter version of it with the Nouman Ali Khan scandal, which is like 2 months before.
Well, I mean, again, the Me Too movement arose from a very serious endemic problem that goes along with a certain cultural norms, basically where women in the workplace are sexually harassed, and I think it was particularly sparked. The irony of it is that it was sparked by Trump's egregious conduct and the fact that he's elected president despite of his conduct, but yet the one who goes through it unscathed is Trump, and the most powerful man for the part of what troubles me again about France is the only person that was outed through the Me Too movement in France to stand criminal charges is Tariq Ramadan, while various officials that were outed by the Me Too movement, no charges was brought against them whatsoever, and the state hasn't even tried to bring charges against them, even when there were complaints filed. That's deeply, I mean, that's deeply troubling, and again, in terms of discrimination in France. In the United States, the Me Too is a political movement, but as a lawyer, there is a huge difference between ranges of conduct. When someone says Me Too, I don't know if they're talking about criminal conduct, or they're talking about a tort, or they're talking about a violation of appropriate social norms. So, you know, someone who's gone out with a date was a superior that they think they would have not accepted if that was not a superior, or they thought if they didn't go out on the date, they thought that it might hurt their chances at advancement, so they went out on a date but they didn't enjoy the date. From their perspective, it's a Me Too. But that's not a criminal offense. Now, it could range from that to something extremely serious, like Me Too, because my boss assaulted me in the office and raped me, and I didn't say anything because I feared losing my job. Now, that's far more serious. So, that ethical introspection, yes, it's important that we have the Me Too movement. It's important that we remind men to behave appropriately, and to having power is no excuse to abusing human beings. We completely sympathize with this, but we also must keep in mind that this is a social media accusation. And a social media accusation is premised on gossip. It's a faceless accuser, without the right to confront and interrogate. And faceless accusers, it's a medium of gossip. And so, while I understand the social utility, I also understand its extreme dangers. Because if Islam taught us anything, it is to be wary of the danger of gossip upon society. And one of the effects of gossip is that it's ironic that where I think sensitivity towards sexual harassment and sexual assault, where it is needed the most, it is missing, because people think that they're doing something about it through the social media. Well, that's not where you need to do where it's most needed. Where it's most needed is in empowering people through law and through actual judicial procedures, and where you can bring someone like Trump and company to hold them accountable for the richest people, for instance, that traffic human beings. I teach human trafficking. Hundreds of thousands of people are trafficked with impunity. The Me Too movement might make people think that good because they're doing something about sexual harassment, while human trafficking goes on unchecked by the most powerful men in society with absolute impunity. So, I mean, it's good. My attitude is that it's good, but it's social media. Social media is a very dangerous medium. It's like smokes and mirrors. You know, it gives you the false impression that you're actually doing something, while in fact you might be doing absolutely nothing, or doing something that is completely misdirected or futile, or we have to be far more wise in this, far more introspective and deliberate in what we do and how we act. than this. I wish that Muslims, instead of wasting all this time on social media talking about what they don't know, I wish they would become active, get active in the human trafficking field, and do something about the millions of people that are being trafficked, even in Muslim countries, because Muslim countries traffic a lot of human beings. I mean, Saudi Gulf countries in particular, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and so on. I wish Muslims would become active in that, rather than sitting there and thinking, oh, well, you know, we're standing for justice by spewing off stuff on social media. And that's not, that's, there are ways to make a difference. It's just sitting on your computer spewing stuff is not the way you make a difference. Okay, shall we do it? I want to move on to Surah al Rahman.